Hi, everyone, and welcome back. It's the third session of the day. We're just waiting for a couple people to come up from the expo hall, so I was told to get up here and delay for a few minutes. So I'm going to do my housekeeping, and then we'll see where we go from there. Just a reminder about the session surveys in the app. So you can get in there and you can rate the presenter. You can't rate me, but I'm pretty sure I get high marks. Let's see my old boss in the crowd there. I'm a little nervous now. There is a 90-minute lunch break after this. There's lunch and learns in these rooms here, but if you don't like learning while you eat, like me, you can grab lunch upstairs. The keynotes start at 2, and then there are more sessions back at 4:15. I'm gonna guess 4:15. Just before I call up Jean, it's my duty to make you guys groan and moan a little bit. So I got a couple jokes. We hear inflation's back on the rise here in the U.S. So, I hear it's so bad that CEOs are now playing miniature golf. Ooh. That McDonald's is now selling the quarter ouncer. That Exxon laid off 25 congressmen. Ooh. And a picture is now only worth 200 words. Okay, I'll leave you with a cybersecurity joke. Some of you heard this when you were in here before, but what's a hacker's favorite sport? Fishing. All right, let me call up Jean. Jean is from Corelight, and she is talking about why you need more than a SOC triad. She told me this. It's impressive. Please welcome Jean.
I think I got this. Thanks. Yep. Good morning. They had asked me, did I want to use the microphone or did they want to wire me up? I told them I had a little bit problem sometimes seeing over the microphone. So we're going to go with this, and I will try not to fall off the stage this time. So, who am I and why am I actually up here talking about why we need more than a SOC triad? So my career has really been spent in the intelligence community, right? So I retired out the intelligence community at about 33 years of service. I spent the first 30 years at the National Security Agency. I had many jobs there, both on our offensive, our SIGINT side, as well as on our defensive side. I listed a couple of the more important ones that I thought that I have learned the most from. One of those was the authorizing official. Sometimes it was before we actually had a CISO. I was responsible for looking at all of the systems, IT systems at NSA that was attached to any of our networks and making that risk-based decision about whether attaching that system to that network would raise or lower our risk profile. So therefore, what I got very intimate with is the inner workings pretty much of all of that. They thought I did such a great job there. They rewarded me by saying, hey, why don't you come be the chief of our networks, and all of that stuff that you were telling us we were doing wrong, go fix it. Okay, so I did that for a couple of years, and then I decided, you know what? I really have played both sides of the fence at NSA. Let me go try to do something different. So I actually went to the Defense Intelligence Agency because they were looking for a CISO. And sure enough, I was dual-hatted as the CISO for DIA, but I also got to run all of the DIA IT infrastructure, including the endpoints, the networks, all of the classifications, including JWICs, and it just gave me a broader view of what everything was needed as you would build these systems on top of one another, right? So if you think about both NSANet or JWICs, right, you have this big global highway of the internet, of the networks that run globally. And then how they came into being was everyone would attach their network enclaves to that. So how did you actually know that you were protecting that in the right fashion? That's what we're going to talk about a little bit more today. When I retired, I just kept feeling the need that I had to do something else. So I did try, and am currently 2.5 years working at Corelight. I wanted to go into a product vendor space to actually be able to help them implement and understand what the requirements were coming from the government, as well as being able to kind of guide the government in this partnership as to what some of the things are that they need to understand about products when they're coming from the private world. So here's the topics that we're going to talk about a little bit today. We're going to talk about the SOC triad, and we're going to talk about, is it enough? I think my conclusion is you need just a little bit more than that, and so we'll talk about why. And then I'll give you some examples of why the context surrounding events is so important and how you can get, perhaps, how you can lower some of your alert fatigues if you truly understand what's happening within your SOC. So lessons from my experience. So remember, adversaries attack government agencies, right? This is where I spent my entire career. Why do they do that? Primarily, they do that for espionage reasons, right? They are looking for information from the US government that would aid them in their national strategies of how they either, whether we're in conflict, how they would like to surpass us or to get to the victory line, or they're looking at things like, how can I steal that intelligence, build that within my own systems, and then we will be more on the even par. So most of my experience really comes into being in that adversaries, nation states that attack the US government systems. Because of that, I am very paranoid. If you talk to the folks that I actually work with, many a times they scratch their heads and they're like, nobody in their right mind would attack us that way. And I'm like, oh yes, they will. I can't tell you why, but just trust me, they actually will. Also, what we've seen is adversaries attack commercial entities, companies, right? So think really of the last decade or so, the rise in the ransomware attack, the financial motivations that they're doing for financial gain, right? And have we helped them over the years? Absolutely. The intelligence community, unfortunately, has helped in over the years with some of our breaches, right? If you go back to Snowden, if you go back to WikiLeaks, many of the hacking tools that the US government used was released. Now there's entire cottage industries all over the world globally that really is focused on financial gain from ransomware. We still have to crack this nut and figure out how to do this better. And then one thing that you may not think about is adversaries actually attack individuals, right? They attack individuals based on who you are. I know very well I can't go to some countries in this world because I would be subject to such an attack. It's usually based on what roles you've had, what do you actually have in your head, and how could they leverage you to obtain information that they really want, right? It kind of falls more in the why under the espionage, but you would be surprised at how often they actually attack you from an individual point of view. I'm going to throw this out there, controversial, okay? You all know the US government is suggesting that TikTok's not a good thing, right, from China. Why is that? So when you look at the adversaries, China is known for playing the long game. So what are they hoping to gain? Some of what they're hoping to gain is to understand, like, my children's actions, right? And they're going to take that information and they're going to store that information And they're going to play this long game, and maybe for 20 years, they're just going to hold on to that information. And then when they want to see what they can get, they will follow that individual to come up and figure out, is there something that they can blackmail them for? Is there really information that they have? Or have they actually gone into a job that they want information from? So when you're looking at the motivations for attacks are quite different. So what do we do about it, right? So this is the classic defense model. This is the model that I was brought up with through my whole career. Of when you look at the classic defense model, you go, okay, let's log everything. Let's put it all in a central location. Let's combine it, let's correlate it, and then I'm gonna just start visualizing and alerting on different events. Right? Sounds simple, right? How can this be that hard? Well, it must be hard because our adversaries are still getting through every single day. Let's kind of dissect this a little bit and figure this out. So all of you by now, I'm sure, have heard about the SOC triad for visibility, right? This was actually coined in 2015 by Anton, who was then Gartner, now works for Mandiant. But it was a cyber analogy at the time for the Cold War concept of the nuclear triad. If you're not familiar, the nuclear triad said, hey, if we get into a major conflict, let's not have all of our nuclear weapons in one place. So what did the US did? We split up our delivery methods, right, for nuclear weapons. You have ballistic missiles, you have submarines, you have strategic bombers. All of them can deliver. If you bring that over into your SOC triad, what that actually means is don't put all of your cyber data in one central location, but you have to look at it from all different sides. So that's where we've come up with endpoint, right? This is the continuous monitoring of all of your endpoint devices. You will feed that into your SIEM. Your SIEM is your collection point where you're going to do your correlation and your analytics to determine what's happening. Your network data. Network is where you actually will identify malicious activity that might be occurring within your infrastructure. So this is a wonderful SOC triad, and you will notice many vendors as well as people will reference this SOC triad. But my experience shows we need more than just those three elements if we're going to be successful to stopping attacks or preventing, right, the escalation of those attacks into breaches. So if you are an organization and you run an EDR, an NDR, and a SIEM, do we assume you're covered? My suggestion is no, we really aren't, right? So let's kind of look at these pieces. Data ingestion into a SIEM isn't as easy as you actually think it is. Every device that feeds into the SIEM, that data from that device has to be normalized and it has to fit into the SIEM content and structure. And to make life more difficult, every SIEM vendor has a different schema that it uses to correlate all of this data. So you need to figure out how do you easily feed this into the SIEM so that it is normalized, so that you can actually use that data with everything else that is being collected so that you can come up with a correlation, right? So let's not just consolidate that data in the SIEM, but let's figure out how to correlate those multiple data sources. And then you'll figure out how, when you enrich that, to actually come up with the context. Context is probably the most important thing that's needed. if you or that person who is sitting on the front line, that defender, is understanding the context of what's happening. So let me give you a couple of examples from places in the intelligence community that I've actually worked. We'll call it Team 1 and Team 2. Team 1 sat down and said, okay, let me look at the risk that I'm going to try to defend against. So they came up with scenarios based on their knowledge of how the infrastructure was put together, based on the knowledge of looking at the threat intel information coming in, so they knew what was the prevalent ways that attackers were going to actually attack them. And then what they had to figure out was, how were they going to take the data, identify the data that they needed to answer the questions for the most likely scenarios of what they tried to protect against, right? So you had people an entire team who sat down and did this. They did it from the beginning, right? They said, okay, here's my scenarios, here's what I want to protect against. Let me go ahead and actually identify what those data sources are that I need to be able to answer these questions. So they identified those data sources, and then they said, okay, this piece of data I needed from the network. This piece of data I needed from an end device. Some of the questions we were asking, they said, I need an identity. They needed some more user information. And at that time was when we were first starting to go into the hybrid cloud, right, into the cloud. And at that time, it was a lift and shift, right? It really was, I'm just going to shift into the cloud. I won't say public cloud because it was a private cloud. But again, it's I'm putting some of my workloads there. What do I need from there? So Team 1 ended up collecting maybe about 20% of the data of all available data that was needed. But based on the context of understanding what it is they were trying to look for, they had about a 90% rate of finding events that were very meaningful and that they had to go find. Team 2, on the other hand, said, give me all the data, give me all the data. I'm going to figure out everything bad. You just keep pumping that data into me. Sure enough, we used up almost an entire private cloud because there's a lot of data. So we pumped all of this data in. They wrote multiple analytics, but what they were missing was the context, right? So they would write analytics that would say, how many of my endpoints didn't have an agent on them to feed me information? There was an entire red blob. That red blob might have got a little bit lesser over the years, but where's the risk-based approach to that? That really wasn't the highest risk that we were facing at the time. They also didn't have the context of where was our firewalls, right? A firewall might be alerting, but is the firewall on my edge between the internet and my classified network, or was the firewall just between a lab and an operational network? Or was a firewall just within my own boundaries that we were using that firewall for a various manner? If you don't understand the context around any of that, you really have nothing but all of these alerts, and you don't know how to actually go triage them or figure that out, right? So context really, really matters. So my premise is we did need identity. Let me give you an example of why we would need identity, right? So one of the questions that we were concerned about was privileged escalation, right? People who have system admin privileges, in other words. Were those people, we wanted to monitor them because those were the folks who would be able to do the most harm for us because they had the privileges to be able to get around a whole bunch of the security mechanisms we had into place. So, some of the questions we would ask would be, do we see a user logging into 2 different places from geographically different time zones? So, for instance, we would catch things like user A's logging in from the Middle East, user B's logging in from Maryland, 5 minutes apart. How in the heck could that happen? We know it's physically impossible to do that. So what did we need to do? So that was an alert that we truly did chase down, and by the time that we knew who it was and we called that person, they were still logged into both times. So you have the security people saying, excuse me, how can you be at 2 places at once? Who did you give your credentials to? And they would be like, how did you know this? And we're like, please just answer the question. And they're like, well, my buddy who just got sent out to the Middle East really doesn't have his credentials yet, so I gave him my credentials, and so he's logging in over there temporarily. And we're like, you know that's breaking every rule in the book. Well, yeah, but we didn't think anybody was going to catch us. Well, guess what? We did catch them, and what it did was actually raise the level of security consciousness of everyone who had system administrator privileges, right? Because once they have figured out that you could see that across the board, so much of what the harmful bad behavior is we were trying to correct actually came into being. So you will notice the Verizon report from this year actually says 49% of the breaches are still coming from identity-based systems, right? Whether it's compromised passwords, whether it's, right, anything to that fashion, and 74% of those breaches actually had a human element involved. As much as we can automate the systems, as much as we can do detections, you still have this human element, which was the worst element to try to correct when you're looking across the board. The sophistication of our adversaries and what they're doing nowadays really brings all of this into being. So if you would start feeding in your identity system into your SOC, you would be able to alert and be smart enough not to just say, hey, log any failed login attempt, but you would be able to mix that information about the identity that you're looking with in context with the different things that you're finding from both the network and the end user, the host-based systems. And so that's why my premise is, if you think through what those likely scenarios are, move into this risk-based management of whatever it is you're trying to protect, you can actually figure out what data elements you need from identity as well as your network and your end user. I'm going to move one more element with this, and it kind of dovetails in with the cloud, right? So most of us today, at least in the government, really run in a hybrid cloud, right? Hybrid cloud environment. We started off that we would be able to use everything within our infrastructure. We can control it, we can configure it, we can monitor it. What happens when you move into the cloud? Many of the cloud services actually are implemented by the cloud providers themselves, right? In a security vernacular, what that means is I am inheriting the trust that that cloud provider is doing. And to date, we've been pretty good with inheriting that trust without any major incidents. But if any of you follow the news, I'm sure you saw this summer that Microsoft, right, their identity management system was able to be subverted, the core of their technology, and adversaries who were there claiming from China was actually able to create the credentials, the identity credentials that are needed. So how much data do you actually need when you're moving your information into the cloud? It is commonly known that the communication between what's happening within those cloud environments isn't freely shared, and honestly for good reasons, but it's not freely shared with all of the consumers of the cloud, right? So how and when do we strike that balance about how much the cloud has to provide inherently to the consumer? You need more than just the cloud log files, right? That's generally what you get today. Many of the vendors, including Corelight, provides that, right? We will be able to see visibility into the cloud just by the cloud native logs, transitioning back and forth. But I'm going to say there's a whole bunch of other risks that people might not be thinking about. So as an organization, if you're moving your workload into any of your cloud providers, did you actually do the upfront work to understand and to tell that cloud provider where you want your data hosted? Do you want it hosted in one data region? Could they put it throughout their distributed cloud infrastructure? Do you know the security controls that they actually tested against for them protecting your data? There's a whole bunch of information that, as a person who accepted risks for a whole bunch of my career, I really want to know so that I can weave that into my risk posture, my risk structure for the organization. So I really think the cloud, information from the cloud, more than just the visibility, I'm talking about your applications, how is your identity being managed in the cloud, all of the rest of this information is something that we have to struggle with and work with those cloud providers and actually figure out how to feed in itself. So if I had a pretty picture, I would say we might want to modify the SOC triad and let's call it the SOC Visibility Quintet, because you really need at least all 5 of these elements, if you do it smartly, to be able to understand what your risk posture is and to understand where your first line defenders, your analysts, needs to look at to actually figure out whether you're under attack. Can you prevent the next attack? Because the goal of this is to figure this all out ahead of time. So I'll close with a simple example. We talk about consolidated data. If you have consolidated data, here's a picture of what you might know, right? We might know a boat sailing into the port. We might know the source IP. We might know where that boat is actually heading. But there's a whole bunch of questions that we really don't know anything about. If we look at correlated data, maybe we know a little bit more. We'll see that multiple boats are actually transitioning in. We could see maybe that they're carrying about the same payload. We still know where they came from and where they're going to, but do we know anything else? What I'm going to share is this gives you a whole different picture. This is what correlated and contextual data will actually give you. It shows you perhaps what the right questions are the SOC analyst should have been asking in the first place. Would they want to know back in these days that an entire colony might be immigrating into their area? I would think they would. Could they have prepared differently for this? What would they have prevented if they understood this picture from the beginning rather than the individual alerts? I know it's a little bit of a wonky example here, but it's just to show you what you can visualize when you're looking at contextual data in the environment that is actually shown in. So what are our takeaways? So my biggest takeaway is I think the SOC triad needs a couple more elements. Identity being one of the big ones, and cloud, one of the big ones. And I'm not just talking about the visibility of it, but actually the context that comes with adding those two areas. I will still supposit that correlation and context are what your first line defenders actually need. Without that, they won't be able to triage those alerts or understand what's prioritized, what they should be looking at, what they shouldn't be looking at. And the proper data sets with the context and correlation is what truly leads to the advanced detections, the rapid diagnosis, and faster incident response. So it looks like we got about 12 minutes left. I do know lunch is after this, but do any of y'all have any questions? Sure.
Quick question. So you mentioned the cloud data, and we have different service models on the cloud. One is called software as a service model. So, and with that model, we really don't see the cloud. We see the service provider, but we do not see the cloud behind. So from the data protection perspective, it's irrelevant. We see the cloud or we don't see the cloud. We do need that data. But is there any regulatory that you see that can actually empower the client to be able to make those service providers to deliver the data that you need?
So I think it's going to be a give and take, to be honest. The only forum that I'm familiar with is the financial community. So if you go Google, the financial community has put together, I think it was the Department of Treasury maybe, put together a whole report specifically saying to move financial data into the cloud from our banks, from our investments, those guys. Here's some deficiencies within the cloud. And one of the things that they identified there was the need to actually get additional data from these cloud providers. That is the only regulation that I'm aware of that might be coming into the government kind of pushing the cloud providers to make sure they're providing additional data.
But is it empowered with some kind of compliance-based?
Well, it hasn't turned into anything compliance-based. It's still in its infancy, right? Right now they're identifying it. And what they're really hoping is to work with those cloud providers so that we can normalize what happens. With the Microsoft breach that happened this summer, only the people who were paying the top tier of monitoring information were the ones that understood that Microsoft was actually breached. Since then, because of the big outcry that has occurred, Microsoft is now providing that to any of its customers free of charge. I think we're going to have a couple of more probably of these incidents before we actually figure out and move that all of that data is given.
Yeah. And I'm speaking of not just the big 3-4 CSPs, but all of the SaaS providers that we have in dealing with, and
Yeah.
it's getting overwhelming.
It is very difficult. I don't know if I actually have an answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
There's been a tectonic shift in the identity model, right? Pre-COVID, most of us were working from home, working from offices. Now everybody is working from home.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means, you can't really predict. So I have users, working here, and suddenly they decide to go to India or vacation, and they're just working,
Yep.
right? So the users are on the move, the devices are on the move, with the new paradigm of work from home or work from anywhere, right? So with that context, how does one of the elements you're talking about, the identity, right? How does that change because of this? We are figuring out, nobody wants to come back. I mean, people
Right.
are trying to bring back people, but nobody wants to come back, right? So this is going to stay there, right? So the identity, I'm calling the identity crisis, right? Identifying who is where at what time, coming from what device, what IP, right? So how does this change your model?
I don't think it changes my model. I think it adds more validation to why we need that, right? Because what COVID did was it accelerated the work from home model, right? Because no one was allowed to come into the office for a while. So quickly we had to pivot to make sure the identity models actually worked in that distributed environment. And location became important as well as identity. And how do you actually make sure that is the proper authorization for the people coming into that environment? So I don't think it goes against. I think it provides the validation for why it's even more important that identity be fed into your SOC.
Can I just follow up on that?
Sure,
Because
absolutely.
part of it is the zero trust, which I think is this construct there. but
Correct.
what I don't see right now is a push of a feedback loop where your security, I know there's SOARs and there's solutions there, but there's no way of saying, look, this context of this user is, say, shape blue or color blue and shape this, and then suddenly that context of the user is coming in different. And there's no way of feeding that back. It's just like, oh, his identity is correct, but to your point, the device, to this, to that, is not tied to what was that fingerprint that he left behind. I'm just wondering if there's any industry drive towards bringing that information back to the identity paradigm, because when someone's logging in, it's like, wait a minute, I just heard from you here and you had this fingerprint. And I just see that's a big gap because there's a window of breach that could be prevented.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just throwing that out there and seeing if you're aware of anything in that.
I am not aware, but again, I am actually not in the identity field at the
Okay.
moment.
Fair enough.
But yes, you're seeing the same problem I am.
Any other questions? Last call for questions. Okay, with that, we have lunch. The expo hall is open, and not that I'm biased, but the swag in the Google booth is it's probably the best. So head on down. Thanks, guys. We'll see you back here. See you 2 p.m. and then 4:15. Thanks, Gene.